Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Catherine Mattice-Sundell here, founder and CEO of Civility Partners. I have with me today Emily Goodson, and Emily and I are kindred spirits because she also does all the culture work. So we are both focused on building culture, though, of course, I specifically am trying to turn around toxic culture. So we'll talk with Emily about what kind of work she's doing. So her company is called Culture Smart, great name. And so she works with startups actually to make sure that startups are focusing on culture and building their culture from the ground up, as opposed to letting it form all on its own, because we know what happens when you do that. Yeah. And she's done a lot of business, worked in a lot of high growth businesses, and done a lot of cool things. And in 2020, she was a rising star female business owner in the San Diego chapter of the National Association of Women Business Owners. So thanks, Emily, for making time for little me today.
You're so welcome. I'm happy to be here. For those who just joined, I was telling Catherine that I just moved, and this is my first broadcast from a new space, so you'll have to excuse the lighting. It's a work in progress.
You are all good. You look beautiful. So talk to me, Emily, about what, I have this real niche around positive or respectful cultures, but
Yep.
You're doing something much different than that, even though we're both in the culture space. So talk to us about what your work looks like.
Yeah, no, absolutely happy to. So my work, I'm a former head of talent people at two high growth startups that were both venture backed. And what I noticed is that from those experiences and from others is I find that startups tend to bring in cultural professionals when it's almost too late. And I started my business to fill that gap. And so I generally take a very generalist approach to culture in my advising work and focus on startups that are typically Series A, Series B, around 30 to 50 employees, and come in and really help build those fundamental building blocks of culture. I think when we think about culture, as you said, Catherine, it's something that has to be intentionally managed. And, if not, your culture is going to grow and develop regardless. And it's just a question of whether you want it to be, as a founder, the culture you envision, or whether you want to let it kind of spiral out of control. And so, I come in to sort of put those basic building blocks in place from a cultural perspective to make sure employees are at a place where they can grow and develop and be seen, be successful, because we all know in turn that equates to positive financial returns, the business results we want, etc.
Yeah. Why do you think it is that organizations, startups, or any that ignore culture, how do they miss that? It's like they have these strategic plans, especially if you're growing rapidly, you definitely have a plan where you're trying to execute to get from point A to point B. They got marketing and how do we take over the market and how do we do all these things? But why do you think that culture is often missed in those strategic planning sessions?
That's a great question. To be honest with you, I think historically it's never been prioritized. I think the way that we have thought about work, quote unquote, historically is wrong. It's backwards. And, I think to date, a lot of us, myself included, have been labeled as HR professionals. And certainly when I think about HR and I think about legal and compliance, like that's very important. And that's certainly a part of what I advise my clients on. But HR should have always been much more than that. And I think just now, one of the gifts that 2020 and the pandemic gave us is that people are really awakening to this idea of, this is more than just dotting our I's and crossing our T's. Yeah. And so to answer your question, Catherine, I just don't think historically people have ever seen the the point of HR culture professionals, aside from making sure we don't get sued. And I think, the pandemic really showed us, as along with other things last year, really sort of brought good people leaders to the forefront. I think about many of my clients, and because I really have a passion for advising sort of heads of people and chief people officers, because I've been there. I know what that role is like. And when I think about the ones who really sort of knocked it out of the park last year, it's because they were at the forefront of advising on, working virtually, working remotely. What does that mean? And I think that caused sort of CEOs and COOs and founders to take note and say, oh, we should involve this perspective in our planning. But I just think historically it hasn't been valued.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was just doing a webinar yesterday and talking about HR has really had the chance to shine. All of a sudden, the industry has a spotlight on it, that there is all this value that maybe people didn't notice before. And like you're saying, part of the battle is, I remember a few years ago, it was always get a seat at the table, for HR. How do you get a seat at the table? And part of it, and I see this in my work, is just that the CEO doesn't want HR at the table. They think they're a cost center and all of that. So I agree with what you're saying, that HR has been able to shine and demonstrate that there is this people component past the compliance, and if CEOs paying attention to that's going to help our paradigm shift. And there's still more time to shine, because HR is not done. People are going to go back to work, but now we have a whole nother marathon to run around rebuilding the culture and everything.
100%. And I think this is, quite frankly, a big question that a lot of people aren't talking about and should be, is the return to offices. Even if it's just, I know we're starting to see some bigger tech companies talk about 10% of their population is coming back, 30%, whatever. And at least from my perspective, what I'm seeing and hearing in the field is, I think people have been very understandably fixated on, when people come back to an office, how do we ensure their physical safety? And that is paramount. It's super important. It should be part of the discussion, but I think we're missing a huge element here of mentally, how are people going to feel coming back? And there's just so much around this return to office question that I think, if you don't already have a head of people, if you don't have a culture advisor, get somebody in there, because this is, I think this is going to be a sort of crossroads moment for organizations, is how intentional are they about returning to offices?
Yeah. And I think too, if you're going to claim that you're an organization focused on DEI, for example, that flex work has to be part of your new normal, that phrase. You can't claim you're focused on DEI if you're not offering more flexible solutions. And so I've been doing a lot of research around that as well. It seems like some employers are really feeling like, I just think everybody should be here. And that's what I think about, in order to have the culture. In fact, I saw a study from PricewaterhouseCoopers the other day that was like 50% of employees are talking about wanting to work for, or still have some sort of flex remote kind of a situation. And something like 68% of company owners are saying, I need everybody back in the office to build culture. So I'm curious about that. That's the $1 million question. If an organization is focused on culture, how do they build culture or maintain a culture in a remote workforce? Because the location is a big part of the culture.
Yeah, it's a huge question, and work has been redefined, culture has been redefined, and I agree with you. I think flexibility is a question employers have to figure out, because everyone's been working, not everyone, but the majority of us have been working from home, and a lot of us are still unsure about what's going to happen with schools, with our kids. some of us are caregivers, and this has always been a tension. And I think now we really have to grapple with this. And, I think another question here, Catherine, that I think about is, what is the inherent bias here from a DE&I perspective, right? And let's say, because I've seen this, like, not even before the pandemic, I've seen this with companies where you have offices in multiple locations, like cities. And the people who are administering the performance management process, which, determines raises, compensation, all of this, there is sometimes bias in leaders for the people who sit in an office with them. Because, if I'm in Chicago and my team's in Chicago, I can see what they're doing every day. But even like somebody who sits in Washington, D.C., I'm not going to see that. So, that's going to continue into this whole discussion of people who are majority remote, majority in an office.
Yeah. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that you're going to it's just easier. It's natural to say, well, they're working harder, so I'm going to.
Right.
Yeah. And I think too, all the conversation around mental health, that all of a sudden we're saying, okay, maybe the stigma's falling away and we're moving in this direction of moving that stigma out of the picture. However, if someone is taking lots of time off to maintain their mental health, that would also be the type of thing that would cause a bias. Naturally, the people who are here all the time, I think they're stronger, and I'm going to praise them and all of that. Yeah. So so what's the answer to that? How do we find ways to minimize that type of bias? The I see you, so I know you're working hard bias.
Well, I think two things. I think, on the mental health piece, because this is, near and dear to my heart, is it has to be modeled from the top, right? And, culture is an interesting thing, right? Because the culture that the leaders want to be created, they really need to be modeling that, and they really need to be ensuring we have policies and procedures that reinforce that. And, if you have a CEO who is pinging people at midnight, who is not ever taking a vacation themselves, who, is demonstrating sort of these behaviors, that sends a message. And, I think on the opposite of that, we saw some beautiful sort of stories last year. And I, with my own clients, have been tremendously touched by some of the CEOs who have gotten up in a town hall or sent an email and said, look, I'm really struggling right now. I have kids. I've got a partner. This is what's going on. I'm really struggling. And I think that sends a very powerful message that it's okay to not be okay. Because to me, this sort of, to nerd out a little bit on people and culture stuff, but to me, this sort of gets back to this idea we've heard of called psychological safety, right? Which is the idea that people feel okay to make mistakes. And it's the same idea, right? If you don't feel comfortable being yourself, if you don't feel comfortable expressing that you are struggling mentally, because you're not seeing it, because that's sort of not encouraged, right, then you're not going to do it. And so to me, a lot of this really stems from leadership, and then also, sort of back to the bias and bias piece, and sort of, making sure just because I can't see you doesn't mean you're not working. I mean, to me, that's a training thing. And, I think training's been a big topic this past year because we've had to do it all virtually. And, we're reinventing things, right? Like things shifted when we went remote for most of us, and things are shifting again now that we're going back. And so I think training is constantly sort of required to help managers and leaders adapt to this new paradigm.
Yeah, agreed. They have to kind of unlearn the old way, and it's really about getting the work done. If we set some goals for you this week and you do it, then I know you're working. It doesn't really matter when you did it, unless of course there's client hours. But by the way, we have a couple people saying hello and letting us know they're listening in. So
great.
Joining us. Feel free to ask questions. You got two culture experts here, happy to answer questions to those listening. I think it is a whole lot of paradigm shifts happening now. And I feel like vulnerability has been coming up a lot for me lately, and just that, like everything you're saying, that vulnerability and psychological safety kind of go hand in hand, and that the leaders have to show some vulnerability in order to make it comfortable for others too. And that lends itself to so many things. If somebody feels like they're being harassed in some way, they're going to tell HR about it if it feels comfortable to be vulnerable because that's a vulnerable place. Or if they feel wronged in some way, versus being angry and just like throwing in the towel and leaving and posting something horrible on Glassdoor about your organization. That's all. I think that type of behavior is the fruit of not feeling comfortable or able to be vulnerable or safe. So it's like, I'd rather just quit and then go post my thoughts on Glassdoor as opposed to tell you about how I'm feeling.
Yeah.
Right.
And what you're saying, it brings up so many things for me. I think, this is why we have to be intentional about culture, right? And this is why we have to be intentional about creating environments where people feel safe to talk and share their opinion and share their experiences. And one thing, sort of getting into the vulnerability a little bit that we've talked about before, is I've been really in the past year trying to lean into my own vulnerability as a person with a disability, because I think this to me is a huge sort of topic around workplace experience that perfectly sort of, what you're saying is perfectly manifested in this. It's, I personally have worked in countless workplaces, and as a child, teenager, college student, in all of my workplaces, nobody ever asked me about my experience with having a physical disability. And that's horrible. Like, that should not happen to anyone. And I think, whether it's a disability, whether it's diversity of another kind, whether it's gender, whether it's I'm introverted and I'm scared to, speak up in meetings because I get silenced, I think it's important for leaders to model that exactly, as you're saying, because there are people experiencing this every single day. This I don't feel seen. I don't know how I don't want to be vulnerable because it's scary. And I think when they see other people modeling it, it can get easier to lean into that.
That's a good point. I like that. So CEOs everywhere, listen up. You got to be vulnerable. Show a little bit of your soft side. Show your whole person. And sounds like that's really, it's funny how things progress over the years. We went from employee empowerment into employee engagement. Now we're talking about psychological safety and DEI, we're slowly moving. We have a question. Someone's asking, could you say more about needing training? What training should be prioritized? How can we help prioritize it among all the other urgencies? So talk to us more about training.
Yeah, this is a great question. So I always tell my clients that if you have a very limited training budget, the first thing to prioritize is people manager training. Because, particularly in startups, which is where I specialize, a lot of people are promoted into manager positions who don't have formal training or experience. Fine and totally great, but we need to get them the training they need to be successful. And, people managers are something that I call sort of high leverage individuals, right? If you train a people manager, they're going to then, sort of exponentially and positively impact the 6 people on their team. So I almost always start with just basic people manager training around continuous feedback, around psychological safety, around emotional intelligence is a huge one for me with managers. And so
coaching behavior and performance. It's not just the performance piece. You got to coach negative behavior too and help people pull out of that. Yeah. So it's
exactly.
stuff.
Yeah. And, from there, I'm always a big fan of assessment, like let your data drive your decisions, right? So if you have a training budget, look at if you feel good about manager training, look at your survey data, look at employee needs, and then go from there prioritizing.
Yeah. And we have another question. How can HR influence culture when it's showing signs of toxicity? I'll take that one and then I'll let you answer. But you just said the answer, surveys. So, and then there's another question about what kind of training for mid-management, how do you get them to adapt? I always think things start with a survey because that's how you're going to understand what your employees need. And then you have that data to say, well, look, 30% of people answered this way on this question. That needs to be 80%. So what can we do to drive the change in that statement that people rated? So it really breaks it down. And then you can sort of prove to your C-suite, for example, that this is the kind of training that we need. Because that, back to the ROI and the CEOs often miss the people stuff. They get focused on market strategy or, building customer base or whatever. But if you could say, look, your employees are saying they need these trainings to be more effective, now there is a business case that goes along with it. So that's some of my answer. I'm curious what other thoughts you have, Emily.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think another thing I would add from sort of the data survey perspective is I've become a pretty big fan of 360-degree feedback for managers. I think we won't get into this because, performance management is a whole nother question. But just with respect to pure coaching, I think, there are lots of tools out there, 360-degree reviews for managers and leaders. I have found them to be eye-opening for people.
Agreed. Yeah.
I found them. I mean, they're eye-opening. I've done them with several organizations, and it's eye-opening. So yes, I think every organization should be doing sort of larger employee engagement surveys. But then I think if you're having, as the question said, sort of these mid-managers or leaders who aren't ready to adapt to shifting paradigms, give them a 360 and let's see what the feedback looks like.
Yeah. And that also goes back to the accountability. So you could say, here's pre-training managers. We're doing 360s and or surveys. Here's the data. Here's a training program or coaching or whatever it is you're implementing. And then you redo that stuff. And that's how you hold them accountable. And so Michelle, email us offline and we'll reach out to chat more if you're seeing some signs of toxicity. Happy to help. And Dinesh says, well said, Emily. So you're getting that. So what are some last sort of final tips for managing culture or building culture in this still crazy world we live in? I can't imagine. It's going to be hard. It's hard to imagine 3 years from now we'll be looking back on this because right now it's so hard. But give us some final tips.
There's so much. I think one takeaway I would say is culture has to be managed. There's an article, and I can share it after this, that I wrote a couple months back with some good friends at a consulting firm called Integral. And we compared culture to like a baby snap pea vine, right? That you're growing in a garden. It's going to grow regardless, but ideally you want to train it up a trellis, right? And so you've got to really, really be intentional about culture. And, we've all seen the media, like we all saw what happened last year when, companies who weren't intentional about their cultures, like it got away from them. And, I think that leads me sort of into a second point is I think the world in which we live in right now, you can't really separate your culture from your employer brand. They're very much synonymous. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of transparency right now because of social media into brands. And, that's a debate for a later day about, sort of the pros and cons of that, but it's a truth. And then I think just lastly, I would say, diversity, equity, inclusion, it's everything, right? Like, I think as we're thinking about transitioning back to offices, we've really got to be thinking about this, and we've really got to be intentional about the intersections and making sure that people feel like they belong. Because I think at the end of the day, belonging is sort of the base of the pyramid to all of this.
Right. Yeah, that's that. You can't belong if you don't feel psychologically safe and all of that stuff that we were talking about.
I love this stuff. I could talk for hours. I
know, Emily, we're gonna have to go on like a 3-week long vacation just so we can say everything we need to say to one another. We have one last question. How could HR make a positive change in the workplace when there is poor leadership and surveys are not an option? So that's a great question, because I joke that sometimes HR has to kind of be a ninja and make things happen without permission from the CEO. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that question. How can HR influence without the CEO's buy-in?
It's one of the things that I've learned in my life is I have a big desire to change things like that. And, I've been in situations like this where, your leadership's not listening. Maybe you've done a survey and they don't care. They're not paying attention. And it's hard. It's really, really challenging. And this is why I actually love coaching people leaders, is because I get it. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I've learned is it's one person at a time, right? And if you can be that safe space for even one of your employees, you're making a difference, and you're slowly starting to change the culture. And I guarantee that if you can be a safe space and listen, or, provide, helpful perspective coaching to one person, I guarantee you're starting to make an impact. And yes, it's frustrating that it's not the bigger positive change you feel like an organization needs, but, it's one person at a time.
That's a great answer. That's a great answer. I love that. And I would add that sometimes based on whatever projects you're working on, for example, performance management, even if you can tweak your system a little bit, just because that's what you do in HR without going and getting permission to, change the whole thing over. But there's ways you can influence culture in the things that you put out from the HR department. And so I think that's key too.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this is a great point, Catherine. I mean, small steps make a big difference. I mean, that's sort of my model when I go into any startup, is like, let's not completely disrupt things with a new process. Let's see what small steps we can take, because doing a 4-question self-reflection performance management form is better than nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily, for being here with me today. I mean, I guess sometimes it's nice to hear like all the stuff I think another culture expert thinks too. So it's good.
Yeah.
I'm on the right track too. Tell us where we can get a hold of you, and we'll make sure we put that in the comments.
Yeah, absolutely. If we didn't get to any of the questions, or if you want more, sort of context, you can email me, Emily at workculturesmart.com. My website is workculturesmart.com. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, and I would love to hear from you. My door is always open, particularly for any HR, people leaders, female founders I love working with. So, please reach out. Love to help.
Yeah, Emily is a great resource, and we're getting lots of thank yous. This was great. Thank you both. So thank you all for tuning in. So we'll see you next Tuesday. And thanks again, Emily. I look forward to building a long and fun friendship with you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Catherine.
Have a great